Chapter 1. Facing the Reality. Have you ever felt like your own voice was a prisoner inside your chest? Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible? Not because they couldn't see you, but because you were too afraid to be seen. Today, on Audiobook English Stories, we begin a journey for anyone who has ever stayed silent when they wanted to scream. This is the story of Elias, a man who lived in a cage made of quiet, and how he finally found the key to break free. Elias sat on the cold floor of a bathroom stall, his back against the hard plastic door. Outside, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses from the company's annual gala felt like a storm he couldn't survive. He was 30 years old, but in this moment, he felt like a small, lost child. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to tuck them under his arms to make them stop. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and every breath felt like he was inhaling thick, heavy smoke. He looked down at his shoes. They were polished and expensive, but they belonged to a man who was paralyzed by the thought of saying hello. He had been in this stall for 20 minutes, hiding from the world, hiding from his coworkers, and most painfully, hiding from himself. He knew that if he walked out that door, someone might ask him a question. Someone might look him in the eye. To Elias, that attention felt like a physical blow. The reality of his life was a silent prison, and the walls were closing in. He realized with a sharp, biting pain that he was 30 years old and he had no real friends, no partner, and a job where he was constantly overlooked. He wasn't living. He was just avoiding. He was a spectator in his own tragedy. He had spent years telling himself that he was just shy or introverted. But as he sat on that bathroom floor, the lie finally fell away. He wasn't shy. He was terrified. He was a slave to a fear that was stealing his youth, his potential, and his dignity. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered, his voice cracking in the empty stall. The sound of his own words felt strange, like a forbidden language. He realized that the cost of his silence had become too high. If he didn't change now, he would wake up at 60 and realize he had never truly spoken to another human being from his heart. Change begins when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing. Change begins when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing. Elias reached out and put his hand on the metal latch of the door. His palm was sweating, and his knees felt like they were made of water. He didn't need to give a speech today. He just needed to survive the walk to the exit. But as he prepared to turn the latch, he heard a group of people walk into the bathroom. They were laughing loudly, and one of them was his manager, the man who held the power over Elias's future. Will Elias find the strength to open that door and face the world? Or will the sound of those voices push him further into the darkness of his silent cage? Chapter 2. The Echoes of Bullying. Why do we stop believing in the power of our own voice? For Elias, the silence wasn't born in that bathroom stall. It was a wall he had been building brick by brick for 20 years. As he sat in his small, quiet apartment that evening, the shadows on the wall seemed to shift into the shapes of his past. To move forward, he knew he had to look backward. He had to face the ghost of the man he had become by understanding the boy he used to be. He closed his eyes and was suddenly 10 years old again. He was standing on a wooden stage in a crowded school cafeteria. It was the annual speech competition, and he had practiced his 10 sentences for weeks. He remembered the smell of floor wax and the bright, hot lights of the stage. But when he opened his mouth to speak, nothing came out. His throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. He looked at the rows of students, and in the third row, a boy named Leo started to laugh. That single, sharp laugh triggered a landslide. Soon, the entire room was erupting in a roar of mockery. Elias stood frozen, his face burning red, feeling like the smallest person in the world. He didn't finish his speech. He walked off that stage in total silence. And in his mind, he made a silent vow. If I never speak, they can never laugh at me again. That vow became his invisible cage. Every time Elias had wanted to share an idea in college, or tell a joke to a girl he liked, the echo of that cafeteria laughter would ring in his ears. He had developed a habit of shrinking. He walked with his head down. He chose the back seat in every room. He became an expert at being unremarkable. He looked at his reflection in his window, the city lights of Seattle blurring behind him. He was carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. He realized that the boy on that stage was still living inside him, crying out for protection, but by protecting the boy from laughter, he was killing the man's future. He was 30 years old, and he was still letting a 10-year-old bully run his life. The past is a place of reference, not a place of residence. The past is a place of reference, not a place of residence. The apartment was so quiet he could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick felt like a second of his life slipping away into the void of someday. He understood now that his struggle wasn't with other people. It was with the echoes in his own mind. He was a man haunted by a ghost that didn't even exist anymore. Elias reached for his laptop to check his email, hoping for a distraction from these heavy thoughts. But as the screen glowed to life, he saw a notification that made his stomach drop. It was an announcement for the new senior project manager position, the promotion he had dreamed of for 3 years. Will Elias find a way to silence the echoes of the past to claim his future? Or will a new, public humiliation prove that he is still just that terrified boy on the stage? Chapter 3. The Lost Opportunity. Sometimes, the world has to break you completely before you can find the strength to rebuild. For Elias, that breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in the main conference room of his office. The air was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and the nervous energy of 20 ambitious professionals. They were gathered to decide the lead for the Evergreen project, a multi-million-dollar account that Elias had spent 6 months researching in secret. Elias sat in the back, his notebook open to a page filled with brilliant ideas. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but it was quickly strangled by the cold hands of anxiety. He watched as Marcus, a man who had barely looked at the data, stood up with a confident smile. Marcus began to present ideas that were shallow and flawed, but he spoke with a loud, commanding voice. Elias looked at his notes. He knew Marcus was wrong. He knew that if the company followed Marcus's plan, they would lose millions. The manager looked around the room and asked, "Does anyone have a better approach? This is a huge opportunity, and I need a leader who isn't afraid to take charge." The silence in the room stretched for 5. Ein Bewird. 15 seconds. Elias felt the eyes of his colleagues scanning the table. He tried to push his chair back, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The ghost of failures whispered in his ear, "Don't speak. They will laugh. You will fail." The silence was finally broken by Marcus. "I'll take it. Sir, my team is ready." The manager nodded, looking disappointed as his gaze swept over Elias one last time before moving on. "Fine, Marcus. The project is yours." Elias felt a sharp, sickening pain in his stomach. It was the realization that he had allowed his own fear to steal his hard work. He had become a ghost in his own life, a man who worked in the shadows, while others took the credit and the glory. He spent the rest of the day in a fog of shame. Every time he saw Marcus laughing in the hallway, Elias felt a fresh wave of humiliation. He realized that the world doesn't reward those who are right. It rewards those who are brave. He had lost his dignity, his pride, and a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity because he was too afraid to make a sound. Rock bottom is the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. Rock bottom is the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. When Elias reached his apartment that night, he didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the darkness, listening to the rain hit the window. He thought about the thousands of dollars in salary he had just lost and the years of respect he had traded for a few moments of safety. He was 30 years old, and he was tired of being a coward. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The humiliation of the morning burned in his mind like fire. He realized that if he stayed on this path, this feeling of worthlessness would be his only companion until the end. Elias stood up and walked toward the small mirror in his hallway. He was done hiding. But as he prepared to speak to his reflection, a terrifying question haunted him. Do I have enough strength left to fight a war against my own mind? Or is it already too late? Chapter 1-0. Word promise. The silence of the night was different after the meeting. It was no longer a shield. It was a weight that Elias could no longer carry. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling of his apartment. The shadows of the city lights dancing in the dark. The old voice whispered, "Go back to sleep, Elias. It is safer to be invisible. If you don't try, you can't fail." But for the first time in his life, a new voice began to speak. Tired, but absolutely done with being afraid. This new voice asked a question that cut through his excuses like a diamond through glass. If not now, then when he realized that his life was a collection of some days that had never arrived. He had been waiting for the fear to go away. But he now understood that fear never leaves. You don't wait for the fear to die. You learn to move while it is still breathing. Elias sat up and turned on the small lamp on his nightstand. He grabbed a notepad and a pen. He knew that if he tried to change everything at once, he would fail again. He just needed to win the next 5 minutes. He needed a promise that was small enough to keep but big enough to matter. He wrote down 4 words on the paper, the 1-0, word promise. His plan was simple. Tomorrow, no matter what happened, he would speak at least 10 words to a person he didn't know. He was declaring that he was no longer a ghost. If you don't fight for what you want, don't cry for what you lose. If you don't fight for what you want, don't cry for what you lose. He walked to the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. He didn't look different yet, but the look in his eyes had shifted. He was no longer a victim waiting for a miracle. He was a soldier preparing for a long, quiet war. He went back to bed, but he didn't sleep much. He spent the hours before dawn rehearsing. He imagined walking up to a stranger. He imagined the feeling of his heart racing. He felt the sharp wave of doubt as the first light of morning touched his window. What if his voice failed him? What if he opened his mouth and nothing came out? The alarm clock sat on his nightstand like a judge, waiting for the day to begin. Will Elias have the strength to utter those first 10 words? Or will the weight of his old habits pull him back into the shadows before he even leaves his apartment? Chapter 5. The first 5 feet. The walk to the local coffee shop was only 2 blocks long, but to Elias, it felt like crossing a vast, freezing wilderness. He had chosen a small shop about 2 miles from his office, a place where no one knew his name or his history of silence. His feet felt heavy, each step sinking into the pavement like lead. He stood outside the glass door for a long minute, watching the people inside. They were talking, laughing, and ordering their drinks with a casual ease that he envied more than wealth. He pushed the door open, the bell chiming like a funeral bell for his old self. The line moved quickly, too quickly. His heart began to race. A frantic drumming against his ribs. He reached the front of the line, and a young woman with a kind smile looked at him. "Good morning, what can I get for you today?" she asked. Elias opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then, too, he felt the heat rising in his face. He wanted to point at a picture and nod, to disappear back into the shadows. But then, he remembered his vow. If you don't fight for what you want, don't cry for what you lose. He took a deep breath, forced his eyes to meet hers, and spoke. "I would like a large black coffee and a muffin. Please." 12 words. He had done it. His voice sounded thin and shaky to his own ears. But it was there. The woman smiled again, tapped the screen, and told him the price. He walked to the corner of the shop to wait, his heart still pounding, but a strange, small spark of fire was beginning to burn in his chest. He hadn't just bought a drink. He had reclaimed 5 feet of territory from his fear. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. He sat by the window, sipping the hot coffee. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Not because of the beans, but because of the victory. He had left his comfort zone. And though he was still afraid, he was still alive. The walls of his prison had not fallen, but he had found a way to open the door. However, as he left the shop, he saw a flyer pinned to the community board. It was a call for volunteers to lead small group discussions at a local charity event next month. His heart skipped a beat. But this time, it wasn't just fear. It was a challenge. He had spoken 12 words to a stranger. But could he speak 1,200 words to a group? Will Elias dare to sign his name on that paper? Or will the first taste of victory be enough to satisfy his hunger for change? Chapter 6. The Art of Repetition. Victory is not a single event. It is a habit born from the fires of repetition. After the 12 words at the coffee shop, Elias realized that his courage was like a weak muscle that needed a strict training schedule. He created a discipline journal. And every morning, before the sun touched the skyscrapers of the city, he committed to 3 uncomfortable actions. For the next 3 months, Elias lived in a state of intentional struggle. He practiced exposure therapy in the small moments of his daily life. On the subway, instead of staring at his phone, he would look at the person sitting 3 feet away and offer a small, polite nod. At the grocery store, he would ask the clerk how their day was going. Every day, he walked 5 miles through the busy streets, forcing himself to keep his head up and his eyes open, rather than shrinking into his coat. There were days when his anxiety fought back with a vengeance, but he had learned a new truth. You don't have to feel brave to act brave. He treated his fear like a loud, annoying passenger in a car. He couldn't make the passenger get out, but he could refuse to let the passenger touch the steering wheel. He practiced his voice in his car, speaking loudly and clearly while driving on the highway, teaching his vocal cords to produce sound without trembling. He was no longer a victim of his environment. He was an architect of his interactions. He was training for a war that only he could see, building a foundation of strength, one uncomfortable hello at a time. Discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. Discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. By the end of the 3rd month, Elias had filled his journal with hundreds of small victories. He could now order food, ask for directions, and even make small talk with his neighbors without feeling like he was going to collapse. He had lost the weight of his initial terror, and in its place, he had found a quiet, steady resolve. He felt like a different man, one who was finally beginning to inhabit his own skin. However, the universe was preparing a much larger test. One afternoon, his manager called him into the office. "Elias," he said, looking over a stack of files. "We're having a regional meeting next week. I need someone to present the quarterly data to 50 of our top clients. I've seen you working harder lately. Are you ready to step up? Will Elias's 3 months of small steps be enough to support him when he has to stand in front of a crowd? Or will the wall of his old anxiety prove to be too high to climb?" Chapter 7. The Panic Attack. Every great journey has a moment where the road ends and a mountain begins. For Elias, that mountain was the regional meeting. He stood in the hallway outside the conference room, smoothing his tie for the 10th time. He could hear the muffled voices of 50 clients through the thick oak doors, and the sound felt like waves crashing against a leaking ship. He walked into the room, and the bright fluorescent lights felt like an interrogation. He sat at the front, his laptop open, waiting for his name to be called. As he stood up and walked to the podium, the room began to spin. 50 pairs of eyes were fixed on him, waiting for him to speak. He opened his mouth to say the first word of his presentation, but his throat had turned to stone. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard that his knuckles turned white, but his legs felt like they were made of water. Tribe. Elias stuttered. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. He saw a client in the front row frown and check his watch. He saw his manager shift uncomfortably in his seat. The panic attack hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He felt like he was drowning in the middle of a crowded room. Without a word, Elias turned and fled. He pushed through the doors and ran down the hallway, not stopping until he reached the stairwell. He collapsed against the concrete wall, gasping for air, his body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The shame was so intense that it felt like a burn. The mind must be stronger than the emotions. The mind must be stronger than the emotions. He sat on the cold stairs, buried his face in his hands, and wept. He felt like a fraud. He felt like all his discipline was just a lie he told himself to feel better. As the minutes passed, the silence of the stairwell became absolute. He reached into his pocket and felt the small, worn notepad. He thought about the coffee shop. He thought about the 3 months of effort. Was he really going to let 1 minute of panic destroy 90 days of progress? Will Elias allow this crushing failure to be the final chapter of his story? Or is there a spark of resilience deep within his soul that the fire of panic could not touch? Chapter 8. The Toast. Failure is never the end of a story. It is simply a rough draft. After the collapse in the regional meeting, Elias spent 3 days in a dark room. But on the 4th day, he realized that a single wall does not define a warrior. He needed a win that didn't feel like a life or death battle, but one that actually mattered. The opportunity came at a small, intimate family dinner for his younger sister's engagement. There were only 12 people in the living room of his parents' house. The air was warm, filled with the smell of home-cooked food and the sound of genuine laughter. As the meal came to an end, his father stood up to give a short speech. When he finished, he looked at Elias. Elias, would you like to say a few words for your sister? The room went quiet. Elias looked at his sister's face. Her eyes were full of hope and love. He realized that this wasn't about him. It was about her. Elias stood up. He took a breath. Not a panicked one, but a deep, focused one. Sarah, he began, his voice surprisingly clear in the small room. You have always been the brave one in the family. I've watched you grow, and I've watched you love. I wish you and Mark nothing but a lifetime of the same courage you show every day. To Sarah and Mark. The room erupted in a warm, gentle cheer and the clinking of glasses. It lasted only 30 seconds. But to Elias, those 30 seconds were a miracle. He had spoken from his heart, and the world hadn't ended. People didn't laugh. They smiled. He had proven to himself that he was still capable of connection. Success is the sum of small efforts. repeated day in and day out. Success is the sum of small efforts, repeated day in and day out. That night, Elias sat on his porch, looking at the stars. He realized that he had been trying to climb the mountain in one jump, but life is lived in steps. He went to his desk and pulled out a small flyer he had taken from a community center weeks ago. It was an invitation to a local speakers circle, a place for people to practice public speaking in a supportive environment. He looked at the date. It was tomorrow night. His heart skipped a beat. But it wasn't the skip of a coward. It was the skip of a competitor. He had won in front of 12 people who loved him. But could he do it in front of 12 people who didn't know his name? Will Elias use this small victory to launch himself back into the arena? Or will he settle for the comfort of a small, safe world? Chapter 9. The Imposter Syndrome. Every soul that seeks greatness must first pass through a valley of absolute doubt. Elias had been invited to speak at a major regional conference, a stage that would put him in front of over 1,000 people. The event was less than 24 hours away. And as the sun set over the city, the darkness didn't just fill his room. It filled his spirit. He sat at his small wooden desk, the glow of his laptop screen reflecting in his tired eyes. The speech was written, but now, the silence of his apartment felt like a judge. A cold, whispering voice began to crawl through his mind. Who are you kidding? Elias, you are not a leader. You are just a coward who got lucky at a family dinner. You are an imposter. Elias looked at the delete key on his keyboard. He had a draft of a resignation letter ready. He could send it now. He could tell them he was sick. He realized that the greatest battle of his life wasn't against the 1,000 people in the audience. It was against the shadow in his own mind. He felt a deep, hollow exhaustion. He looked at a blank white wall in his room. And for a moment, he truly believed he was going to quit. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Elias stared at the blinking cursor on his screen. His finger hovered over the button that would cancel his appearance and end his journey. The rain began to beat against his window in a steady, mournful rhythm, matching the heavy throb of his heart. He was tired of fighting. He was tired of being brave. Will Elias click send and disappear back into the shadows of his silent prison? Or is there a reason to keep the light on for just one more hour? Chapter 10. The decision to lead. The silence of the night was broken by the sound of Elias's own heavy breathing. He looked at the resignation letter on his screen, his finger trembling over the send button. But as he stared at the words he had written to quit, something deep inside him, a spark that had survived the rain, and the panic began to glow. He realized that if he pushed that button, he would be choosing to stay the brave coward forever. No, he whispered, his voice small but sharp in the empty room. He realized that the ghost of failures was a liar. He stood up from his desk and walked to the bathroom mirror. He saw the fear, but he also saw the miles he had walked, the coffee he had ordered, and the toast he had given to his sister. He went back to his desk, but he didn't click send. Instead, he selected the entire draft of his speech and hit delete. He realized he had been trying to sound like Marcus, loud, perfect, and aggressive. But he wasn't Marcus. He was Elias, a man who knew what it felt like to be broken. He opened a new document and began to write from a place of absolute honesty. He wrote about the bathroom stall. He wrote about the 10-year-old boy. He wrote about the fear that feels like drowning. He spent the next 4 hours writing with a focus he had never known. The words flowed out of him like a river. He was no longer a victim of his past. He was the master of his message. Be brave enough to be bad at something until you are good at it. Be brave enough to be bad at something until you are good at it. As the first light of dawn touched the window of his Seattle apartment, Elias felt a strange sense of peace. He was still afraid, but the fear was no longer in control. He dressed in his best suit, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the 10-word promise he had written months ago. It was a relic of a different man. He walked out of his door and headed toward the conference center. Each step a declaration of his new identity. He was no longer a ghost hiding in the shadows. The conference hall was a massive, modern building, made of glass and steel. As Elias walked through the entrance, he saw the thousands of people milling about. He walked straight to the backstage area, his head held high. Behind the heavy black curtain, he could hear the announcer introducing the event. He looked at his notes one last time. The curtain began to move, and a bright, blinding light spilled onto the stage. Will Elias's new voice be strong enough to reach the back of the room? Or will the lights of the stage reveal a man who is still truly afraid? Chapter 11. The Voice That Shook the Room. The curtain pulled back, and the world became a sea of blinding white light. Elias stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the polished wooden stage. The room was a vast cavern filled with over 1,000 people whose faces were lost in the shadows. He felt the familiar chill of fear. But as he reached the center of the stage, he didn't see enemies. He saw 1,000 versions of himself, people who were also hiding, people who were also afraid, people who were waiting for someone to tell them it was okay to be human. He adjusted the microphone, the sound of his breath echoing through the speakers. He didn't look at his notes. He looked straight into the darkness. 10 words. He began, his voice surprisingly steady. 3 months ago, I was terrified to speak 10 words to a stranger in a coffee shop. He told them about the bathroom stall. He told them about the school stage and the laughter that had followed him for 20 years. He spoke about the promotion he had lost and the shame that had almost drowned him. As he spoke, the room became so quiet that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The 1,000 people weren't judging him. They were leaning in. Elias felt a surge of energy that was more powerful than adrenaline. It was the energy of truth. He realized that when you stop trying to be perfect, you become unstoppable. He reached the end of his story, his voice rising with a strength he didn't know he possessed. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the mastery of it. If a man like me can stand here today, then there is nothing you cannot face. He stood there for a moment in the absolute silence. Then, a single person in the front row stood up and began to clap. Then another. Then a dozen more. Within seconds, the entire hall was a thunderous roar of applause. Over 1,000 people were standing on their feet, not just for the speech, But for the man, everything you want is on the other side of fear. Everything you want is on the other side of fear. Elias walked off the stage, his legs shaking, but his spirit was soaring. He passed Marcus in the hallway. For the first time, Elias didn't look away. He offered a small, confident nod and kept walking. He walked out of the building and into the cool evening air. The city of Seattle felt different, brighter, weiter, and full of possibility. But as he sat on a bench to catch his breath, a young man approached him. The man looked pale. His hands were trembling, and he had tears in his eyes. Will Elias realize that his victory was only the beginning of a much larger mission? Or is he satisfied with his own personal freedom? Chapter 12. The Brave Coward. Success is not just about a single moment on a stage. It is about the person you become after the lights go out. As he walked through the streets of the city the next morning, Elias no longer walked with his head down, counting the cracks in the sidewalk. He kept his chin up, his shoulders back, and his eyes open. His transformation was visible in the small things. At work, he didn't wait in the back of the room during meetings. He sat at the table. When Marcus tried to interrupt him, Elias didn't shrink. He simply raised his hand and said, "En high nod preceders and nosen now. I'm not finished yet." With a calm, steady voice that commanded respect. He had embraced his new title, the Brave Coward. He was a man who was often afraid. But he was also a man who never let fear make his decisions anymore. He began to take on more responsibilities, not to prove himself to his manager, but to test the limits of his own potential. He found that the more he spoke, the more he had to say. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Elias looked at his old 10 word promise notepad, which was now filled with hundreds of pages of notes and reflections. He realized that the paper was a record of a dead man. In his place was a man who had stood before 1,000 people and shared his deepest pain. He was free, not from fear, but from the limitation that fear creates. One evening, he was invited to a small community gathering to talk about his journey. As he stood in front of the group, he didn't see a crowd to be feared. He saw a garden to be watered. After his talk, a woman approached him. She was holding her hands tightly. Her eyes filled with the same desperate loneliness Elias had felt for years. "How do I start?" she whispered. Will Elias keep the secret of his success for himself? Or will he realize that his new identity comes with a new responsibility to the world? Chapter 13. The Echo of Courage. True wisdom is not found in the height of the mountain you climb, but in the path you leave behind for others to follow. Elias sat in a small neighborhood library, looking at the faces of 20 young men and women who were just like he used to be. They sat in the back of the room, their shoulders hunched, their eyes fixed on the floor. He began to share the lessons he had learned. He spoke about the art of starting small and how a single, shaky hello can eventually lead to a voice that shakes a room. He watched as their eyes began to lift. His legacy was not the applause he had received at the conference. It was the courage he was now planting in the hearts of others. Your voice is a gift to the world. He told a young girl who was crying quietly in the second row, "Don't worry about being perfect. Just worry about being present." He often walked past the old school cafeteria where his fear was born. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt gratitude. He understood that every difficulty he had faced was a necessary part of his training. To move the world, we must first move ourselves. To move the world, we must first move ourselves. Elias was no longer just a man who had overcome social anxiety. He was a beacon for the lost. He spent his weekends helping others find their words. He realized that the brave coward was a title of honor. It meant that he was a human being who felt everything. The fear, the doubt, the shaking, and did the work anyway. As he walked home through the bustling streets of Seattle, he felt a deep sense of completion. He had traveled from a bathroom stall to a stage of 1,000, and finally to a humble room where he could serve others. But as he sat down at his desk to record his final thoughts, he saw his microphone waiting for him. He knew he had one final message to deliver to you. The listener, are you ready to stop being the victim of your own silence and start becoming the hero of your own voice? Or will you let your story go untold? Chapter 14. The first step of your new life. You have walked a long, difficult road with Elias. You saw him hiding in a silent prison, and eventually rise to stand before 1,000 people with a voice that shook the room. But as we reach the end of this journey on Audiobook English Stories, I want you to realize something very important. This story was never really about Elias. It was always about you. Every lesson Elias learned is a tool that you now hold in your hands. Remember the word discipline. Remember the word relentless. And never forget the power of the small win. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The world might tell you that you are a coward because you feel afraid. The world is wrong. Being brave is not the absence of fear. It is the mastery of it. Elias was still afraid when he ordered that coffee. The difference is that he stopped letting his fear be the captain of his soul. He decided that his potential was more important than his comfort. What about you? What is the invisible cage that is holding you back today? Is it the fear of being judged? Is it the shame of an old failure? It is time to stop being a spectator in your own life. The pain of discipline is far lighter than the soul-crushing weight of regret. You do not need to be perfect to start. I want you to make a commitment right here, right now. Do not just listen to this story and walk away the same person you were an hour ago. I invite you to leave a comment below this video. Tell me, and tell the world I am starting small. My first step is, and name your action. Your voice is your power. Don't give it away to fear. Your voice is your power. Don't give it away to fear. The sun is rising on a new day. The path is waiting. The wall of your anxiety is tall. But you have the strength to climb it. 1 inch at a time. Go out there and speak your truth. Go out there and take back your life. Your new world is waiting just one brave word away. God bless your journey. And remember, we believe in you.